the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
Welcome to the Gab community. You can always find back versions, our previous episodes of this show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and we play on the weekends on the405media.com, 5 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday. So the big news this week was the Las Vegas shooting. What we know as of this point is just in the last day or so, some more specific details about the shooter, whose name we're not going to give, has come out. So we know he went up to the 32nd floor of Mandalay Bay and had plenty of time to set up and fire down on this crowd at the festival across the street, and has killed upwards of almost 60 people, injured 400 or 500. There's some debate about what weapons he was using and the rest. What I find most fascinating, of course, the left is relieved it's an old white guy. That's, so they're going to... One thing is, since it's an old white guy, we're going to get mainstream media coverage of this shooting for 2 to 3 weeks pretty intensely. When it's not a guy that fits the narrative, which seldom it's not, either it's a minority or religious Muslim, somebody motivated for some other reason, then we usually get no more than a week's worth of coverage, and then it's time to move on. I mean, the Orlando shooting was pretty much gone within about 2 weeks, and that was the previous record holder for the number of deaths. Certainly the most injured here, because he got off so many rounds. He has the record for the most injured, and that probably won't be topped for some time unless you set off a bomb or something like that. So anyway, what I find most fascinating about this is the meticulous planning and the fact that he is a multimillionaire. He's a very unusual mass shooter for these reasons. It appears, from what details we have about how this shooting was executed, it appears as if it was very meticulously planned, perhaps over months, maybe even years. He purchased a lot of the guns in October of 2016, so that's going to be a curious question is, that's the month leading up to the election. What motivated him in that month to make a lot of those purchases? But then he doesn't actually execute his crime till a year later. He's been buying guns for decades, and also he had reserved hotel rooms in other places, Chicago, Boston, other places, for festivals, concerts that it looks like he may have been thinking of as targets. He didn't ultimately show up for his hotel rooms there, and did in this place. Owns a home in Reno, owns a home outside Las Vegas in Mesquite, about an hour away, and owns a home in Florida. Owned and operated a apartment complex in Dallas at one time. His father was once on the FBI top 10 list, a bank robber, ran over a cop in the pursuit of being arrested in the 60s, was deemed a sociopath at that time. This guy was taking medications. That's another question, is to what degree were the medications he was taking having an effect on him? But I'm fascinated by the fact that he's as wealthy as he is.
Did he own a home outside of Reno or outside of Vegas?
Well, the home outside of Vegas was in Mesquite, about an hour and a half away, and then he had a home in the Reno area. So he spent time in both places. The girlfriend from the Philippines, she leaves 3 weeks for her version of this story is that he sent her away to go visit her family. She's there, then she gets this deposit of $100,000, which she's initially excited about, but then thinks maybe it's his way of breaking up with her. So she's definitely woven a story, or let's put it this way, she's telling a story that would seem to make her ignorant of everything that was going on. That may be true. That may not be true. Time will tell. But I think when you're dealing with a murder-suicide, there's some suggestion that he had an escape route, but he did ultimately end up taking his own life when the cops descended on his room, which they did within about 15 minutes, so they actually moved pretty quick. It took them about an hour to get into the room because once they got there, they said the firing stopped, so they took their time to safely try to enter his room, and he apparently had killed himself pretty much by the time he saw them approaching.
And they got there so quickly because of smoke, or what was the deal?
So what I read, and what I think is the truth, was that, first of all, a security guard descended on the room first and was shot through the door. So that was certainly a tip-off that that was the right place. But the cops apparently had figured out it was coming from the Mandalay Bay, and then when they got there, at some point it was communicated to them that there was a smoke detector going off in that room, which would have been produced by those guns. And that may have been the tip-off that allowed them to very quickly get to isolate his room and to get to it. They didn't enter for another 45 minutes or an hour when they exploded the door and came in, but it appears as if he'd been dead from the moment they approached the door. But again, what I find fascinating is the wealth. You don't see, I don't know of another instance of a mass shooter who was wealthy like this. Even the suicide bombers in the Mideast who work on behalf of Islam, they're not necessarily all poor. Sometimes they come from the middle class, but the wealthy are usually the mentors, the people who are recruiting or paying for or sending suicide bombers. They never actually do it themselves. And I just think that that's the most fascinating piece of this from the crime standpoint. What makes this guy unusual, besides the meticulous planning, is that he was so wealthy. Normally you would think he has something to live for. So was he terminally ill? That's a question I think that needs to be answered. Or had he, based on his father and DNA, did he have deteriorating mental health that had led him to decide that he wanted? But again, the question is why go out in a blaze of glory like this if you are dying and you just want to take your own life? ISIS has been claiming since the beginning that this is their recruit. He recruited 6 months ago. Zero evidence provided to back that up, and the intelligence communities in the United States are totally poo-pooing that. But my question again is, this is so meticulously planned that he clearly had an axe to grind. I mean, I don't believe this is just somebody who wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, because it's just too well planned. He put too much time and effort into executing a crime like this. And I would be very shocked if this just turns out to be the work of a madman, just a crazy madman, because to me, that kind of planning signals some kind of an intent, he had enough of his faculties to figure out the guns he would needed, the opportunity. He was clearly staking out other places. He really spent a lot of time meticulously thinking about how to execute this crime. And I would be shocked if that didn't come with some kind of an agenda. Maybe it isn't ISIS. It may not have anything to do with ISIS, but this guy had an axe to grind. Everything about this crime says that he had an axe to grind. So we're only a few days into this, so we'll wait and see if more information comes out. I do think it's worth noting, though, that the victims in this case, I think, acted, for the most part, with heroism. It looks like, we are seeing stories of people men covering women, covering wives, soldiers immediately going into action. A lot of off-duty cops and veterans in this crowd because it was a country music festival, and a lot of people just snapping right into their roles of protect and serve and do the right thing, and many of them died or were severely injured in doing that. So, we're still getting those stories, and those are going to be the heartbreaking part of this, is that a lot of people who'd accomplished a lot in their lives and have been real contributors to society and devoted family, men and women, just, good salt-of-the-earth folks enjoying a concert, paid with their lives because they were randomly hit by the bullets or showed courage and a desire to help others and paid for their lives with that act as well.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting how he turned his semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons with something called bump stocks.
Did you know what that was?
No, I had no idea, so I had to look it up. So what I found out is that they originally were intended to help people with limited hand mobility fire a semi-automatic without the individual trigger pulls required. They can fit over a rear shoulder stock assembly or on an automatic rifle, and with applied pressure, cause the weapon to fire continuously increasing the rate from between 45 to 60 rounds per minute to between 400 and 800 rounds per minute. So it is estimated he fired for what, 10 minutes?
10 to 15 minutes, 12 minutes, I think was the number I heard.
That's a lot of ammunition. You know, some of the talk that I've heard on various sources is that maybe this can work as an event to draw Americans together instead of being so divisive like we've been.
Sadly, I'm not convinced that that's going to happen. I think the story moves on within a few weeks. Something else will draw people's attention. I don't think it's a catalyst event. When it comes to issues like the gun control and the Second Amendment, we're not only divided on the issue, people are divided pretty severely on the issue, but everything they're bringing as far as their understanding, informed understanding, is diametrically different as well. People who support the Second Amendment do so for very constitutional and long view reasons. As Rand Paul recently tweeted, the reason we have a Second Amendment right is not to hunt deer, but it's to shoot back at the government when they become a tyranny. So there's something in the original Constitution and the concept of the original Constitution that feared a government, because of course that's what they had just overthrown, was a tyrannical government, in which, remember, the British moved out to Lexington and Concord to try to confiscate the arms of the Minutemen because they wanted the citizenry to remain disarmed so they could maintain control of them. So it was in the founders' mind that they never really wanted the government to be better armed than the citizenry. Now, obviously, arms have changed and become much, much more deadly. But that basic concept of it's not okay for the government to have access to arms that the people don't have access to, because then there's a power differential problem and it's easier for the government to become oppressive. That's on the minds of people who support the Second Amendment. People who don't live in the present. Their whole politics are about rejecting various parts of the Constitution anyway as outdated and outmoded. Most of them, and we've discussed this before, are the cloud people of our society that live in a world in which everything is provided and everything is interlinked. They don't know how anything works or how it gets to the store, and so they've already sort of given away in their hearts and minds this idea of self-sufficiency because they live in a very connected world in which they depend on so many other people, including the government, in their minds, to regulate and control the arrival of all these goods and services that they consume. And so they just can't even get their mind around the idea of the government as a tyranny because they're already enslaved to it. Of course, they would never use that word, but let's find a less controversial word. They're already dependent on the government. And so, in a way, they've already given over to that tyranny, a soft tyranny, if you will, and they are much more afraid of the in their minds, they're much more afraid of the Second Amendment, folks. In other words, they're much more focused on the individual event in front of them in which some people are killed, and to say, and to call for that immediate reaction and to believe that somehow gun laws are going to save them from that, and they don't give a hoot about the philosophical background or the long term or any idea that by disarming the citizens you might be subjecting yourself or your descendants to a fate far worse than the kinds of shootings that we see now and again. And a good example is in Europe. I mean, they have massive gun laws there, and yet it doesn't stop Muslims from getting a hold of AK-47s, and then everything's a gun-free zone for them. And when they can't get the guns, they just drive trucks and run over, the French people or the German people in mass at their festivals. So to make it about the guns is to miss the point, but I'm not even going to try to fully argue the other side. I think we're all aware of it. Good example of this sort of disconnect is look at the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, who never misses an opportunity to take a shot at Trump. So as soon as the shooting occurs, he says America needs more gun control. Now this is absurd times 10 because he's the former head of a country that has very strict gun laws and is a gang wasteland. People are beheaded on a regular basis. The people of Mexico are at the mercy of all the criminals who have all the high-powered weaponry. And even the government that has the high-powered weaponry takes bribes from the criminals, so they might as well be the criminals as well. And all of the disarmed citizenry of Mexico is at the mercy of these folks. And then you have this Orwellian moment where the former president of Mexico says America needs gun control laws. It's nuts. And I think, what doesn't get addressed in these shootings is that half the time we're dealing with Islamic fundamentalists, and no one wants to confront that issue. At least no one on the left wants to confront that issue. But for the most part, we're also dealing with mental health issues. In the vast majority of cases, we're dealing with people who have severe mental health issues. And a number of the most prominent ones, mentally ill people, coming on or off very significant psychotropic drugs. And it's the left that spent the last 50 years closing down all the mental institution under this idea that the mentally ill are just like the rest of us and they deserve to be mainstreamed into our society. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to make an argument of how valid that was or how good or bad that was, but that's the connection between the mass shootings. People in this country have always had access to guns, but when you have essentially taken the position that the mentally ill should be treated where they stand, essentially, and that they will walk amongst us, and you live in a free society where people have access to guns, obviously those guns are going to fall into the hands of the mentally ill. It's A plus B plus C. I mean, it is a foregone conclusion. Now, of course, the left, after they have deinstitutionalized everyone and taken this idea that the mentally ill should walk amongst us, no problem. And again, I'm not necessarily arguing against that, but I am going to say that the same folks who brought us that wonderful policy then say, oh, yeah, but now that that's resulted in mass shootings, the rest of us who are not mentally ill have to give up our gun rights in order to live in a world where the mentally ill run amok. So again, they're all for the freedom of the mentally ill, but your freedom to own guns or to be able to protect yourself or your family or to be able to resist a tyrannical government, no, they're not interested in that freedom. It's very selective, and it seems to be, if you're looking for a common denominator, and I think a lot of leftists don't even understand what they're doing as they push these policies, but it's all about essentially making us weaker, and it's all an effort to essentially treat us as teenagers or as children because we can't have guns, and don't worry that, that we don't have to make hard decisions about people who are mentally ill. We don't have to make hard decisions about locking up people in prison who commit crimes, right? It's all just about, the elites will take care of this.
Talking about prisons, that's a hot button for me because at least half of all the people in prison have mental instability. And so when we closed down all of the mental hospitals, all that did was either put them as homeless people who sometimes committed crimes themselves, or they committed a crime and ended up in prison.
Right.
So, it's like the old argument about preparing people or finding out their problems and helping them before they do the bad things.
The other part of this, and I will get pushback on this, and I haven't reached a conclusion on it, but I have noticed the trend of the use of these antidepressive drugs. It is such a common denominator. Now, of course, it's a chicken and egg issue of just because you have a group of people who are shooters and they're taking these antidepressant drugs doesn't mean the drugs is the cause, because obviously they're dealing with mental health issues, and so they're going to be taking drugs. And then some of them are shooters, so that doesn't mean the drugs are the cause. I totally get that, and that may absolutely be the truth. But I do think that it's interesting that a lot of the times when we're seeing somebody who basically has a psychotic break like this, although we may not be dealing with that with the shooter because, again, it was very meticulously thought out. But I'm talking about shootings in general. A lot of times we're dealing with someone who is having a psychotic break. And time again, I hear the story of they came off their medication.
Yes.
So it's this process of coming off the medication. This is a phenomenon that the medical community is very familiar with, which is that people take a drug, it works, and then they think they're cured, and so they stop taking the drug. Or they don't like some of the side effects of the drug, it makes them feel too flat or what have you, and they don't want to take it. But what we're talking about here is there appears to be a really severe reaction when people come off of these drugs. People who are depressed take the antidepressants, it seems to be working, and if for whatever reason they stop taking them, they don't go back to the level of depression they were experiencing before they took the drugs. They fall into a much more severe hole. I have some experience through a family member's friend who, again, was taking antidepressants, stopped taking them, and within 2 days had gone in the backyard and shot himself dead. Obviously, and the story on that was that he'd become far more depressed from the fall off of of stopping the drugs than he had been before he started taking them. And I don't think people are having enough discussions about that. So it may not be the drugs themselves. The drugs may actually be helpful and very important for people. But what we may need to be addressing is how do people come off of these drugs? And of course, what's happening, even if you identify that as a problem, is that people are doing that on their own. They go pick up the prescription, they go home, they take the drugs for a week, they decide they don't want to take them anymore, and then no one's around when they're not taking them for the next 2 days. But I think that's an issue that's worth investigating and that people aren't talking enough about, which is how do we get at that moment where either a person is told to stop taking the drugs or they're choosing to do it on their own, and there may be a 2 to 4 day or 1 week period there where they are dangerous, either to themselves or others, because what may be resulting as a result of the discontinuance of the drug is that they have just a complete bottoming out emotionally. And I don't see a lot of people talking about it. I do feel like it's connected to some of the shootings.
Talking about drugs, we'll have to do a segment sometime on advertising of drugs on TV and how this has increased people asking their physicians to give them this wonderful drug that they heard about on TV. But for another time.
Do you really? Because you made me think about, I was a guest at a Toastmasters this week, and one of the presentations from a retired doctor was about this very issue. And his point was that drug companies didn't used to be able to advertise. They could only advertise to doctors, and they could not advertise to the general public. And his argument, which I think was quite sound, is that the public is not able to discern the merits of these drugs, and essentially it's just Madison Avenue marketing designed to
sell.
Well, just to pique their interest, right? Whether it's Viagra or it's a heart medication or what have you, it's pretty easy to convince a person that they need this drug if they are experiencing any of the issues that the drug is advertising for. But that doesn't necessarily mean they have any idea whether this is the right drug for them or whether they should be taking it or how much or what have you. And it does work. They do a lot of kind of pumping and dumping. If you know anything from the stock world, they do a lot of pumping and dumping. What he was describing was that because there's a concern always that there'll be some side effect when it's massively rolled out that will cause the drug to have to be pulled from the market, the pharmaceutical companies' entire marketing structure is around trying to get the profits right away. So they come out with these massive ad campaigns and they try to get people buying the drug because they're operating under the premise, because it happens with some regularity, that somewhere down the road within the first 6 months, 8 months, year, what have you, there'll be enough side effects reported that the FDA will require them to pull the drug. So they're trying to make the profit quickly, essentially, and that's why they go out with these blitz campaigns designed to try to get as many people taking the drug as soon as possible.
That's disgusting, and I wish you hadn't told me that.
Well, so his argument was that the ban should be put back in place to advertising directly to the public. I'm generally libertarian on this stuff, but I'm open to that discussion because they're already heavily regulated anyway, and I think that it's clear the strategy that's being used here. But I have a problem with the doctors. The doctors are supposed to be the medical community's buffer on this, and it seems to me like, if you're the doctor and suddenly 100 of your patients are asking for X drug from Pfizer, and you're just turning around and writing the prescription to keep your patients happy, I mean, that's pretty pathetic to me. You should be the one saying, we don't know enough about this drug yet, or I'll give you a sample to try out, but don't, here's the drawbacks. Don't assume that this drug is going to work for you.
My particular doctor said it just wastes their time having to explain to people why that isn't the drug for them. It just wastes the physician's time because they don't or very seldom go ahead and prescribe it.
I think there's a broader discussion here, too, about the fact that, a lot of these drugs, this doctor that I heard this week was talking about there is a placebo effect and that sometimes people just do get a little bump out of taking something that the advertising has convinced them will be helpful. There's always a sort of psychological element to this stuff. But I also think that you have in many cases, pharmaceutical companies putting out a drug that has a marginal effect. So it might help slightly. But because they can show in research that it helps some, right? Even if it's slight, they can suddenly do this blitz campaign and get everybody buying these pills that are $100 a piece, or even more expensive. And it may have a very marginal effect on them. But, we're dealing with life and death issues and people concerned about their health. It's very difficult to say to somebody who's, say, 70 years old, you're probably likely to live to be 78. And if you take this drug that Pfizer is giving, you might live to be 78 and 2 months. I mean, statistically, according to their own research, 8 years from now, it may add an extra 2 months to your life. But by the way, it's $100 a pill. So you're going to spend $150,000, or you and your insurance company, everybody's going to spend $150,000 or $200,000 or more over the course of these 8 years. Can most people even have a rational discussion about that? If they even know that information, would most people say, I'd rather not? But again, we don't have as much of a free market as we need, because I can already envision some pushback solutions. If you're the insurance company, and let's say the scenario I just outlined is true. You know this about a drug, that you're going to have a raft of customers that are going to come through and ask you for this. And you can, on your actuarials, you can figure out that on average, these customers are, your clients are going to cost you $150,000 for this medication. And it's only going to add 2 months to their life over the course of this, say, 8 years. Why not offer them $50,000 to turn it down? In other words, if you're the insurance company, say, look, if you want the drug, fine, but here's the evidence. It's only going to add 2 months. And wouldn't you rather have $50,000 in your pocket right now to go on vacations and cruises and go enjoy your life?
So the insurance company is going to pay somebody. You're suggesting they pay someone.
I'm simply arguing that if you allow a market to flourish, there are ways to encourage the insurance company to try to educate their own customers about this and sit down and look and say, look, we're all going to make, in other words, this is my point about having health savings accounts, and you've got to have the customer tied to the cost in some way, shape, or form. I mean, if the cost is shifted off to third parties, then people are just going to demand. But if you have a market in which people have to make some assessments, then if a person has a health savings account and they have a catastrophic insurance and maybe they have a drug plan coverage and they see the ad, and instead of having to ban the ad, I'm saying, if you had a real market, you'd have a customer who says, I think I want this drug. It says it's good for my heart. I want to take it. But when they go to the insurance company, you could have, as one scenario, an insurance company that says, hey, look, let us send you the information that shows, at best, this is going to add 2 months to your life. It may do nothing, but at best, it may add 2 months to your life over the next 8 years. And here's how much that's going to cost you and us over the course of that time. Wouldn't you rather just have $50,000 right now and not have the pill? And I think a certain number of people are going to rationally say, yeah, I'd rather go on a bunch of cruises with my wife. And, 2 months really isn't that much, and I'd rather do that. But you got to have some kind of pushback incentive. If you just make third parties pay, and then you tell customers, hey, this pill's going to be great for you, even when you inform them that it only adds 2 more months to their life, they have no reason not to still want the pill.
Well, of course, you understand that these new medications coming out are not generic. And so the insurance company is going to pay very little against their cost, because they're going to be a tier 1 or a tier 3, or however it goes in reverse. They're going to be so expensive that only people with a lot of money are going to be able to afford them.
Sure, and the insurance companies do bulk. They negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies. I'm not trying to get into the weeds about all of that. I'm just suggesting that there isn't any incentive in the system for the patient to take a rational view of things, because the cost is shifted off. If I only have to pay $100 a month, no matter what, then why wouldn't I go to my doctor and demand every pill that comes along? And it doesn't matter if the doctor and the pharmaceutical company say, look, even if you take this pill for 10 years, you're likely to, the studies have shown it has only a small benefit. You're only going to get maybe another month's worth of life out of this, and here's how much money we're going to spend. I'm going to look at them and say, it's still only costing me $100 a month. I don't care how much it's going to cost all of you.
So do these ads always include, and of course I know the answer to this is no, but they should include a message that says, Talk to your doctor to see if this is right for you.
Well, they usually say that.
Do they?
No, they almost always say that. But what, of course, isn't communicated is what's the actual benefit. I mean, what's communicated I think what people take away from the ad is, ooh, I'll live forever, or I'm going to live a lot longer. No one really takes the time to learn, as I was saying, and that's why I started on this conversation, is a lot of times they've only produced a very marginal benefit from their drug. But as long as they can claim it will benefit you, right? I mean, if I can add 2 months to your life over 8 years, and so all I claim in the ad is we're going to add, we'll extend your life. That's technically true. It will extend your life, right? So if someone hears extends my life and they run to the doctor to get it. But when you sit down with them and do the cost-benefit analysis and say, hey, wouldn't you rather use this money for something else? I think you can have a much more rational conversation. But we've totally detached the patient from the cost.
So a better idea is to get rid of the ads on TV.
Except that you're still not getting at the point that I'm making about the cost and people demanding it because there's third-party pay. So my point in pushing back on just banning the ads is it's another Band-Aid. I mean, we've been spending 70 years creating this Escher painting system. Our healthcare is so patch-wired. And it's because we've essentially done exactly this. One problem, we isolate a problem, and then we say, oh, well, we'll just ban pharmaceutical advertising. And that little Band-Aid goes on, and we think, and then 2 days later another problem crops up, and we decide, oh, well, we're just going to ban that, or we're going to regulate this. And 70 years later, what you get is this multi-headed Medusa healthcare system that we have because we've tried to address issues like that.
Okay.
So let's talk about Puerto Rico. So the president goes to Puerto Rico. He's taken nothing but flack from the mainstream media because he didn't do enough, he didn't work fast enough. And they're trying to make a comparison to Katrina. There is a comparison to Katrina in the sense that both places were run by Democrats for decades. Their infrastructure was shot. The people had no sense of self-sufficiency because there was a high level of government dependency in the populations. And then a disaster comes along, and not only does it collapse the putrid infrastructure that's there, but the people are helpless because they have no resiliency or sense of self-sufficiency because they're on various forms of government welfare, and they don't even mentally think that way anymore. They just assume the government's going to help them. And in both those cases, the federal response is a little bit delayed because FEMA relies on its local partners. So Texas is ready to go. And, Florida's ready to go. They have an infrastructure. They have competent people ready to move into action. And FEMA sort of acts as an assistant, shoveling supplies and material in so that the local community can get what they need. What happened in Katrina was that a lot of assurances are given by local folks, none of which was true. And then ultimately, the federal government had to come in and take over every aspect of essentially government facilities and government transportation and all the rest in order to get the supplies out, created a delay. Same thing in Puerto Rico. Because it's on an island, it took some time to get things there, and I don't think anybody anticipated the level of devastation or the total incompetence of the infrastructure. The Teamsters decided to call their people basically on strike and to not drive trucks and help because they thought this was a good time to negotiate.
You're kidding.
And you had a bunch of government workers that didn't show up. So then suddenly, they may have all the material and the supplies, but now suddenly the governor of Puerto Rico is telling Trump, I actually need people. I need actual people to distribute this all. So now the administration has to send trucks. They have to send bulldozers. They have to send 10, 15,000 troops to simply become the police, become the National Guard, which is not there. And then a bunch of the National Guard in Puerto Rico didn't show up. So that creates a delay when there's no competence whatsoever. Now, I guess you could make the argument that Republican presidents should assume that Democratic areas are completely incompetent and plan accordingly, but that doesn't say much for them. I think he's done a fine job. My main concern here is, and I said this right as the disaster occurred, this will be an excuse for a full bailout of Puerto Rico. In some ways, and I'm not making light of the deaths that have occurred in Puerto Rico, but this will turn out over the next 10 years to have been a very good thing for the people of Puerto Rico because they were sitting there bankrupt with an infrastructure that's old and out of date and that they could not afford to replace. They owed creditors upwards of something like $50 billion or more, and there was no way out. They were looking for a bailout from the federal government that was not coming. Now a hurricane comes through and destroys everything, and as part of disaster relief, their electrical grid's going to be completely rebuilt. All of their roads are going to be, and transportation systems going to be completely rebuilt. They're going to have aid coming probably for a year or more to supplement folks. And so at the end of the day, and Trump's already said, I've seen him say in public, that the debt's probably going to have to be wiped out. He says, sorry, Goldman Sachs. I don't know who holds that debt, but it's probably going to have to be wiped out. So exactly what I predicted is happening. Essentially, Puerto Rico's going to get the bailout it was looking for, and it's going to get completely rebuilt.
So outside of the loss of life and the going through devastation, they're going to end up better than they were.
Well, I'd make the argument, if anybody wanted to attack me for somehow suggesting that they're better off because people died, well, actually, the way they were going, people were dying. Think of the services that were being cut and the levels of poverty there and the fact that they weren't going to be able to get rid of their debt. It's impossible to quantify it, but I guarantee you more people were going to die on the fiscal road that Puerto Rico was on over the next 10 years than died in this hurricane. So at the end of the day, in a really weird way, you could probably argue 10 years from now, that hurricane saved lives. Because if they end up with a better infrastructure, a totally rebuilt modern infrastructure, then, it's impossible to quantify what that means for infant mortality and childhood accidents and deaths and, response times. Think about it. If the infrastructure is solid and new, the amount of time it takes the ambulance to get to your house when you're having a heart attack is much shorter than if there's a delay in the call, there's a delay in the response, or the roads are not good enough, and that delays the ambulance. And that will never be quantified. People who would have died of a heart attack or some other injury, they bled out because they cut themselves and paramedics were not able to get there in time. Now with a brand new shiny infrastructure, lives are going to get saved because the response times are going to go way down. That's just one example of how a totally rebuilt infrastructure is going to save lives over time.
So is U.S. paying for all of this?
The federal taxpayers will pick up every dime of this.
And so none of the other countries are helping. Why are we?
Puerto Rico's a territory of the United States. They're American citizens. I just think I know people will attack me for this, but Puerto Rico got lucky. The hurricane is actually a huge break because they're going to get the debt wiped out. And on top of that, they're going to get their entire infrastructure rebuilt by Uncle Sam. This is literally 4 times or 5 times more than they wanted from the federal government before the hurricane. All they wanted from the federal government before was to have a bailout. They wanted to have their debt reduced. They weren't even thinking that it was possible to claim, hey, will you wipe out my debt and actually rebuild all of my infrastructure? But the hurricane has done that for them.
Wow.
Now, that does not change the underlying corruption problems in Puerto Rico. So this is like buying a whole bunch of brand new cars and homes for poor people in the inner city. It's not going to change fundamentally who they are. Come back and look at those cars and homes in 10 years and tell me that it was a good investment. So, I'm not suggesting that there shouldn't be humanitarian aid or that structures don't have to be rebuilt. But I am saying that any idea that this is somehow going to change the trajectory long-term for Puerto Rico, well, I think that's up in the air.
So of all these hurricanes, I think we've had an unusual number, or at least unusual amount of damage from hurricanes this year.
It's been a brutal hurricane season, but it was, of course, completely dead for like 12 years. There were no significant hurricanes for over a decade.
So how does our government pay for that? Do they put some money away each year for hurricanes that are going to happen?
They do, but it got totally used up. Matter of fact, I think the fund had either had $20 billion in or it was $20 billion in the hole. So almost all of this money is debt spending or, it has to come out of the budget. And of course, it'll just get piled into everything else. So the key thing to remember is that 40% of everything the federal government spends, it spends on the credit card. Because every budget, 60% of it is paid for with tax dollars that have actually come in one way or another, and 40% of it is bonds that we issue to bring in the rest of the money. So whether it's military spending or food stamps or building highways or FEMA relief, it's all part of the larger budget in one way or another. And we only generate enough revenue in this country to cover about 60% of that.
And so we increase the debt ceiling.
Correct. I saw something today that the federal government is running, the debt increased for the 60th consecutive year, something like that.
Oh, my.
I want to talk a little bit about Catalan and their move for independence in Spain. This has been an interesting story. First of all, I should say that I am a big fan of countries breaking apart and local control and independence. I think that in general, the larger the government becomes, the more disconnected it becomes from the citizenry. And this is just a mathematical issue too. It's like, think of your own neighborhood. Your own neighborhood could have a homeowners association, and there's probably even disagreements there at the homeowners association level. But there's a lot you have in common, and you can solve a lot of problems. Now imagine if the neighboring two homeowners associations were fused into yours. Totally different developments. They were done by different developers. The homes look different. It's a different development. But they're merged in, and now you have one homeowners association for all three. Well, I bet the level of disagreements go up. And there's a sense of, what is that development over there getting that we're not getting? Their roofs are more expensive to replace, or their community fence is more expensive to replace because there's more of it. So there's a lot of equity issues that go on suddenly when you merge these homeowners associations. But still, there may be a lot of things you have in common. Now imagine you merge 50 homeowners associations together. Imagine the disputes. This is my point, whether you're talking about the 50 United States or whether you're talking about the EU. As you create these sort of big federal bureaucracies, the level and extent of the disagreements from locality to locality goes up. And what governments do is homogenize. They create one-size-fits-all rules. So if it's your homeowners association, that's one thing. If it's your state, that becomes a little less comfortable because it doesn't quite fit everything in the state. If it's your federal government, now suddenly people in D.C. are creating rules that have to apply to the guy in rural Idaho and the city dweller in Houston and the Manhattanite who lives on the 100th floor of a skyscraper, and they all have to live under the exact same rules when their lives have almost nothing in common. But that is what is happening. And so that is what's sparking Brexit and the Catalan independence movement. And ultimately, Italy's only 150 years old, and I spent some time there, and I can tell you North and South Italy, they don't like each other very much, and I could see Italy breaking apart. The Basques in northern Spain certainly want to go. We have separatist movements in the United States that, are grow as time goes on, and it's all as a result of this sort of top-down behavior that creates a tremendous sense of frustration among people that would like to have more control over their own lives and their own communities. Now, the folks in Catalonia, tend to be pretty liberal on the communist end of the spectrum for me. So I may not agree with the country that they would create or what they would do with it, with their freedom, but that doesn't stop me from supporting their independence. Even if at the end of the day, I would rather live in the rest of Spain than in Catalonia based on the politics of the two places, that doesn't mean I'm going to support Spain in what it's been doing, which is essentially just sending in the police to crack heads. And I have to say, the Catalonian people have been very smart about how they've handled this whole independence movement. They've been given no real opportunity to hold a legal election, so they decide to hold their illegal referendum, and they're very, very meticulous about remaining peaceful. The police come in and bash heads, and even when some people want to push back, the others are immediately on them saying, no, 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 and stopping any physical violence back towards the police. Now, I know there were a few instances, but basically it was very lopsided what happened during the election. The police were quite brutal, dragging people around by their hair. They were coming in, ripping out ballot boxes. They used their truncheons on people, and there's some picture of an elderly lady with her face bleeding. They were firing rubber balls at the crowds. Really brutal crackdown. And the Catalonian people, almost to a person, were, I think, from a tactical standpoint, brilliant about remaining peaceful through all of that and not responding in kind. it immediately elicited sympathy for them, and I think it also elicited a lot of sympathy among Catalonians who were not previously in favor of independence. So as far as I'm concerned, Madrid has completely blown that. I mean, they just, from a public relations standpoint, they just completely screwed that up and gave away the high ground on the whole thing. Now, the problem the Catalonian separatists have is that they're not actually united in separating. You have some percentage of Catalonians that don't even want separation, and even though a lot of people are claiming that's a majority, I don't think it is, because if Madrid really thought there was a majority for staying, they would have allowed a legal vote so that they could just for once and for all say, look, you don't even have support. I think Madrid feared there was majority support, and that's why they didn't want to allow a vote. So whatever the number is, assuming there's a majority in support of the separation movement, within that, there isn't actually a majority to separate. There's a large number of pro-separatist Catalonians who simply want to fight for separation in order to get a better deal with Madrid. So they're already, this constitution that creates Spain is, or the current Spain, is not that old. It goes back to 1978. And it allows Catalonia especially a great deal of autonomy in the constitution. And so they have a lot of control already. But of course, it's one of the richest areas, if not the richest area, and so they pay more taxes than they get back in services. And this is a common gripe all over the world, where the wealthy areas don't like to see the money flowing out. They just want to bet. There are a number of people in the separatist movement who they don't really want to leave. They just want the threat of leaving to get Madrid to give them a better deal on how much tax revenue stays within Catalonia and how much control they actually have over their own community. Well, and this is where I think it's ballsy, but Madrid seems to be playing the game of calling their bluff. They're not even open to negotiation. They're refusing to even begin talks with the Catalonians, who are threatening to separate as early as Monday. And the bluff seems to be working, because there's apparently, from what we're seeing, a rift within the separatist movement between the people who were always for it and really want to call for independence, and claim independence on Monday, and the separatists who just thought this was an avenue to getting a better deal and are now kind of going, oh crap, because they, now they're going to have to declare independence on Monday, and they kind of don't want to do that. And they're basically begging Madrid to open talks with them, and Madrid is saying, no talks. So it's going to be, the next few days are going to be interesting.
Wow. So on next week's podcast, we can talk about what happened on Monday.
And whether or not they actually went through with it and pulled the trigger on, raised the flag on independence and tried to do it. And then, of course, what Madrid's response is. I think Madrid intends to respond in a military fashion completely if there's an actual claim of independence. So we'll keep our eye on that. Tom Price resigned from office, and of course the story of his resignation was around these private airplane flights that he was taking. I always thought that was BS. I think that maybe 10% of the reason Tom Price is gone is because of the stories that were done about the private airplane flights that he was taking on taxpayer expenses. 90% of this is Tom Price did not get repeal and replace through the Congress. If there's one thing we've learned about Trump, and in some ways it's almost amusing because that's what his television show was about, You're Fired, right? Is that Trump, if you watch that show, he gave people tasks, and if you were in the group that lost, somebody got fired. And so, Trump gives people a lot of latitude. He's very big on delegation and saying, look, I'm not going to meddle and I'm not going to micromanage this. Here's your objective, go do it. And he's not afraid to surround himself with giant egos and all of the rest. But you do have to deliver. And it's not like anybody can point to him and question him. He ran for president of the United States, a campaign that nobody said he could win, and he got it done. So he's the ultimate producer as far as give me an impossible task and I will get it done. He got himself elected president of the United States. So BS walks at this point in the Trump administration, because no accomplishment that anybody could do in the administration can top that one. All right, so there's no room to whine that the guy who's delegating to you hasn't walked the walk. And it's clear, it's just crystal clear that Trump looks at Tom Price and says, Rodney, you had one job. There was one pin on the floor and you were supposed to hit it. That's it. I hired you because you were a congressman who knew this issue and knew all the players and could get the bill through. It didn't get through. You're fired. And I think it's as simple as that. And I think it's why Reince Priebus was fired. These things are not hard to figure out. Almost everybody in the administration has a task. Sometimes they have more than one, but they're usually, there are key people that have been tasked with key accomplishments. And if those things don't happen, they're gone. And, the press likes to make a big thing out of the turnover in the Trump administration as if it's a bad thing. But I don't think Trump sees it as a bad thing. I don't think he's worried, whether somebody lasts 1 day, 1 week, or the whole 8 years of his administration. That does not matter to him. What matters to him is competence. And you sell him on, hey, I think I can do this for you, or I know I can do this for you. And he says, okay, you're hired. Go do it. And then excuses walk. You either deliver on that and you get to stick around, or you don't and you're gone. And that's everything, as far as I'm concerned, in explaining the Price resignation. So there's been some pushback. Steve Bannon is out there now making it clear that he's going to be recruiting and supporting candidates probably pro-Trump, but basically nationalist candidates. He wants candidates that agree with Trump on these issues that he ran on, the immigration issues and the economic issues, the trade renegotiations, and all the rest. And it's clear that the stumbling block is the GOP. I mean, I have been using the hashtag worthless GOP in my social media posts, and if you follow me, that we got to take a bunch of them out. We got some great news on that. The three objects of our ire in the Senate, we've made tremendous progress. I mean, Jeff Flake is clearly not going to win his primary, and we have a good candidate against him. I still think another one may come along, and we're going to have to keep an eye on that. We've got Danny Tarkanian running against Heller in Nevada, which was the other one. And then we didn't have an opponent against Corker. But then as soon as Strange won, Corker announced his resignation, and Marsha Blackburn was thinking about running, but everybody was worried about whether or not the governor of Tennessee was going to run himself. He announced today he is not going to run, and immediately Marsha is in. So she is the front runner, both in the primary and then in the general election, and I fully believe the next senator from Tennessee is going to be Marsha Blackburn. That is a huge improvement to go from Bob Corker, the never-Trumper, to her. And we are well on our way to improving that Senate caucus. I don't think when they come back into session in a year, I don't think we're going to have John McCain. We're not going to have Jeff Flake. We won't have Bob Corker. And it's looking like we may not even have Dean Heller if we play our cards right. So I'm contemplating at this point, because we've been so successful, whether or not we need to add a Senate race or two to this mix to take out some more incumbents. But frankly, if all we do on the incumbent side is to take out those three, that's a huge, huge accomplishment. And then, of course, we've got these 10 Senate seats that are currently held by Democrats that are in states that Trump won. And there's a bunch of recruiting going on right now, so we just have to keep our eye on who the Mitch McConnells of the world are recruiting for those seats. But Bannon's right on this. He's clearly involved in his own recruiting to make sure that there is a Trump nationalist running in these states for these seats. But very exciting news, a lot of great progress on that. I'm very happy. I have seen some people that I like on social media pushing back on Bannon, still smarting over the Strange loss, people who basically kind of back Trump no matter what on anything he does. And I'm a huge, there's no bigger Trump fan than me, but that doesn't mean I'm a robot on this. And as I've explained before, I think that Trump had to endorse Strange for some very specific reasons. The man had been loyal to him and delivered votes. And frankly, I think that's the right move. The president needs to be supporting people who delivered votes for him. And he needs to be seen to be defending that guy until the very end. That's totally fine. We're all smart enough to understand, though, that even if Trump wants that guy and feels like he needs to deliver that out of a sense of loyalty, that doesn't necessarily prevent us from going and finding a much better candidate and supporting that person. In this case, as I said before, I'm not convinced that Judge Moore will be a better vote than Strange. The problem here was that McConnell and those folks had seen this as a symbolic race. It had become a fight between the Bannon side and the McConnell side of the Republican Party. And for that reason, because either candidate probably would have been a decent vote, it was important for Moore to win because, again, instantly, within an hour, Corker had announced his retirement. Those never-Trump Republicans began heading for the hills the moment they saw the outcome of that race, when they saw the power and the ability of the Bannon team and the Palins and the Nigel Farage and everybody else that got behind him to deliver, and with the voters sticking with them and not just automatically with Trump or automatically with the GOP spending $32 million in that race. That was a really important message to send, and we're going to send some more shortly, but they're starting to get it. Danger, Will Robinson, that many of their careers are on the line. I know as things heat up, we addressed this in the last podcast, that there is this sense of everything is going crazy, and wouldn't it be nice if things could calm down? I'm hearing this. When Doris and I are out at dinners with friends and the rest, you can just sense among people in the core of America that there just seems to be so much friction and so much fighting and violence. And, of course, we know from the statistics that 95% of the coverage of Trump is negative. And so this creates this very uncomfortable feeling that things are coming apart. And I'm going to say this again because it's one of the core reasons that we do this podcast, is that a lot of why it feels like that is because the people on the left purposely want you to feel that way. They are contributing to this sense of it coming apart. They are contributing to this sense of strong disagreement and non-peacefulness because they know we are the first ones to cry uncle in that scenario. That it is the core, not the fringe in America, the people who actually make this country run and who are, for the most part, Trump voters and not Democrat voters. It is those people who have built their lives around having a peaceful life and having things be normal. The other side is very comfortable in the dirt and in the violence and in the unease because, frankly, a lot of them have mental health issues and that's the way their life is all the time anyway. So they're not as opposed to that. And what they're looking for from us is that kind of WASP response, that white Anglo-Saxon response of just kind of wanting things to be okay, for everybody to be smiling and hugging each other. This is, I remember growing up Catholic, right? Peace be with you. There's always a moment at every service when we turn to each other, even to strangers we don't know, shake their hand and say, peace be with you. It's instinctual on our part to want to bring it from level 8 from level 8 down to 6. Or if it's at 6, we want to bring it down to 4. We always want to do things to ratchet the heat down. And they know that. And that's why they want to make it as unpleasant and uncomfortable as consistently as possible so that we will capitulate. Instinctually, we'll just try to give on our issues so that we can, look at the NFL thing. I know a lot of people out there are like, I don't want to give up the NFL. I don't want to have to send a message on that. Can I just watch NFL in peace? So I see a lot of people making excuses in their own minds like, well, maybe I'm just going to let the NFL get away with what they're doing because I want to enjoy my NFL. They depend on that. That's the calculation that they're looking for, is that in a few weeks, we will just decide to go back to watching the NFL because that's what we want, peace and comfort and a nice quiet Sunday afternoon. And that they can go around, with some regularity sticking us in the eye and we will take it.
Yeah, you used the word that they contributed to this unease. I thought that was kind of weak. They cause, not contribute.
Well, I agree. But, we also contribute. The whole point of Trump's movement is to say, I can play in the mud with you. He stirs it up. He stirs the pot. Now, we've argued in here that it's almost always a reaction. He doesn't instigate anything. But the point is that he doesn't do anything to try to lower it down. Trump doesn't see the left coming at him at an 8 and say, as Republicans have done for 50 years, I'm going to respond with a 4 because I'm going to bring this down, right? I'm going to take the high road. Trump says, I'll see your 8 and go to 10. You want to play like that? So, he does contribute to punching back and to keeping it uncomfortable because he's not going to surrender ground. And while a lot of us have bought into that, I'm just saying that, at the back end of the wagon train of our movement, there are a lot of people, saying, I don't like it at 8. Can't we get it back to 4? I'm much happier when it's at 4. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. I mean, that's who we are. And so, again, part of this podcast is to try to encourage people to check yourself when you're having that automatic response of wanting to go back to the calm and say, this has to be this way. And the other side loves it. We're wrestling with pigs in the mud, right? The old saying is that never get down in the dirt with a pig and wrestle a pig, because you both get dirty and the pig likes it. Well, okay, but the point is that if you're not willing to engage, if you're not willing to wrestle, if you're not willing to get dirty, then you always lose. And that's what's been happening for a long time.
So it seems like you have to choose between what you believe and how comfortable you want to be.
Exactly. And this is what I've been arguing now for 19 episodes, and I'm going to keep arguing for the next 50 episodes, is that we have to adjust our framework. When you're with your family or what have you, you go to Disneyland, you're going to have your timeouts, but when it comes to the politics, it's fine to seek peace in the level of 4 or 2, and everything else in your life. But when you're reacting to Trump or you're reacting to what's going on in the political world, you have to separate that out and say, no, that can be at level 10. That part can be at level 10. I'm going to back up the Republicans that fight at a level of 10. And I'm not going to contribute to pressuring my side, the anti-left side, to ratchet it down. You have to be okay with them not ratcheting it down and not be the John Kasichs of the world. He's threatening to leave the party. I'm willing to get the moving truck for him. So Doris and I saw American Made, which is the Tom Cruise movie in which he plays this guy Seal, who did a lot of the drug running for the Colombian cartels in the 80s and was running guns for the CIA as well. Doris, what did you think?
Well, first of all, I think Tom Cruise is often overrated as an actor, but this particular part was absolutely perfect for him. A combination of seriousness and humor. It was a lot of fun to see.
Yeah, I will say that, I've talked before about how Hollywood's been sort of on this fix to do these stories about the 80s Colombian drug cartel. They've almost done a Rashomon Rashomon was this famous Japanese movie in which you saw the same scene, I think it was a rape scene, from 3 different perspectives. So the movie replays the same story, and it's almost an entirely different story because you're seeing it from 3 different people's perspectives, even though it's the same event. And the idea was that, obviously, nothing is for certain. Depending on what role you are in an event, you see it differently. And it's movie buffs love it, and, it's celebrated in that way. But Hollywood's essentially done this with this 80s Columbia movie. They made this movie Blow with Johnny Depp, which tells this exact same story from the American drug smuggler's point of view. And the Netflix show Narcos, for the first 2 seasons, told this exact same story in the 80s from Pablo Escobar's point of view, the Colombian kingpin who was shipping the drugs to the American who was receiving them. And now American Made is the story of the guy who was flying those routes and bringing the drugs from one to the other. And so what's interesting is that in all 3 of these, the other characters are there as minor characters. But, in each movie or TV series, one of them gets, we get it from their perspective. So it's interesting from that standpoint, but I would say of that whole trilogy, if you will, or Rashomon, this is the weakest entry of them all. It's the least historically accurate. It's the one that plays the most fast and loose with what actually happened. The other 2 are closer to the facts, but it's entertaining. It's got some great laughs. It's definitely not something that I would say not to see if you're at all interested in the subject matter or if you like Tom Cruise. It was fine. I mean, I would essentially give it a B because of how historically inaccurate it actually is, even though it claims to be a true story. It goes out of the way. The producers are left-leaning, and so it goes out of its way to take some shots at Reagan, which are actually false. And so for that reason, it gets a B. But it was funny, so there's that. We're just about out of time. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. So I'm hoping you will turn one friend, just one friend, that's all we ask, onto this podcast and bring us another fan who loves it as much as you do. You are not alone, Trump supporters. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.